Why do you need a gun? This is one of the common questions we face when talking about guns to people who oppose gun rights. Pro-gun rights people would say it is for self-defense. Anti-gun people would then say learn martial arts, use a bat, you do not need a gun. Pro-gun people may say it is unreasonable to fight against a thug with a knife or a gun with just fists or a bat. Anti-gun people might then say you can fight with a knife or any other means, and you would not have to worry about thugs with guns if all guns are banned. To people who sees reality for what it is, arguments of the anti-gun people would be absurd for a number of reasons which I will cover. However, let's focus on an aspect of the comments of these anti-gun people for a moment. If you look at their comments, you will see a pattern. You can still fight with a bat. You can still fight with martial arts. You can fight with knives. Their focus is on opportunity to do a mere act of fighting. There is a total absence of any thought given to the result of the fighting. There is also an absence of any thought given to the objective of the fighting. Fighting is not the objective. The end state objective is justice, not a mere attempt at resistance. Sure, a person with a bat can fight against a group of gangs if there is no consideration given to the result of the fight. Sure, a person only using martial arts with punches and kicks can fight against a thug armed with a machine gun if it does not matter if that person lives or die. That is the type of absurd arguments presented by the anti-gun people who appears to live in a fantasy world where thugs fight their victims in a one-on-one sports ring setting with equal level of violence. One error of that line of thinking that I will address is the wrong definition of right of self-defense. What is right of self-defense? A right of self-defense is not merely a right to fight. Right of self-defense is a right to secure liberty against wrongful infringement. That includes right to fight, however, it is more than a right to resist, it is a right to have justice. To secure liberty, each individual must have capability to use force to protect it against opponents who infringe or threaten to infringe on it. Liberty originates from reason and enforced by will and force. There is no evidence of anything in nature or supernatural force that defines liberty as righteous or something that we are entitled to. Any liberty we have is a result of human reason, will, and ability to enforce it. Liberty is secured by force, not claim of righteousness or an idea of entitlement that only exists in someone's mind. Such force can be of many forms. In modern society, it is more of a political force than physical violence, and it can also be an economical force. However, all of those forms have a place in securing liberty. This makes right of self-defense means to effective self-defense, and gaining capacity for effective self-defense an inherent foundational right to liberty. A feature of liberty is that it is defined by reason and desire for each individual to live life the way the individual chooses while not infringing on that right of others. And logical reasoning of what is inherent to make that possible is what determines rights. The definition and right derived from it does not depend on what is liked or disliked by the majority. Liberty's characteristics are undemocratic, and it should not be democratic. Majority will or popularity is irrelevant to what defines liberty and what rights are foundational to it. Majority will is irrelevant to what is truth or a fact, except for truth or a fact about majority will itself. In a pure democracy, majority will becomes the rule forced on others, while in a republic of liberty, minorities are protected from the majority. Without weapons, an individual is subject to subjugation to anyone who is stronger, anyone who are more numerous in numbers when such opponents are willing to infringe upon the individual's liberty. Even with moderate weapons such as clubs or rudimentary knives, the situation is not significantly changed. Who has more brute force or who has more numbers will still mostly decide who will prevail. However, when guns are involved, the situation changes drastically. Even with many opponents against one individual, each members of the group of opponents will risk death. When a single strong thug targets a weak individual, that thug's superior strength is greatly negated against an individual with a gun, even if both are armed with guns. A situation in which an individual has no effective resistance to subjugation to a thug who is physically stronger or thugs who are superior in numbers is, in effect, not a society of liberty. This is especially so when that situation is coerced on the individual by that society's rule. A person defending oneself against an unarmed thug with a fist, or a person fighting with a knife against a thug with a knife, involves both parties taking damage. Right of self-defense is not about fighting on equal terms. Right of self-defense in society of liberty means a right to deny damage to rights under liberty. Each person has a right to refuse any unjust damage. There is no duty whatsoever for individuals to risk damage to protect a thug from the risk the thug created. A person fighting against a thug in self-defense receiving damage is not justice at all. So, equality of level of force has no relevance whatsoever to what level of force is justified in right of self-defense in terms of philosophy of liberty. This is to a great extent represented in laws of USA. This is the reason why you are justified in using a gun to shoot a thug who only has a knife if that thug is posing a threat of serious injury or death. The point of focus on what justifies deadly force is threat of serious injury or death. Whether if a thug is projecting that threat by a knife or bare hands is completely irrelevant. An innocent person fighting a thug with equal level of force beating each other to death is not the idea of justice under liberty. A thug posing a threat of serious injury or death being dead while the defender being unharmed is what more aligns with the idea of justice under liberty. Mere availability of weapons does not suffice for a right of self-defense to exist under principle of liberty. There are many countries that allows ownership of guns but do not allow use of it for self-defense. Right to use force, including deadly force for self-defense, and availability of weapons as a sufficient means to it must both exist for a right of self-defense to exist under principle of liberty. Allowing force but only allowing punching with fists as a means to it against multiple thugs or a thug armed with a knife is effectively no right of self-defense at all. Ideally, the burden of proof should be with the government to prove beyond reasonable doubt that a use of force is not a self-defense when prosecuting unlawful violence against others. I believe it is a dangerous practice to make all violence unlawful as a default, then make an exception for a person who proved that the person used force in self-defense. That practice requires the accused person to prove the person's own innocence, which is wrong by principle. People in USA will often mention Second Amendment of the US Constitution in relation to gun rights. I did not mention much about this. While the Second Amendment does have a role in legal terms, it is not the origin of gun rights. The Second Amendment is a recognition of an existing right under liberty, not a source of that right. Other than saying that the Second Amendment codifies an existing right, and I wish the founders codified it better, I have nothing else to say about it at this point. Let's expand the examination to include the issue of right of self-defense in countries other than USA. It is important to note that each countries and cultures have different ideas about liberty. Unfortunately, absolute majority of countries are not societies of liberty. There is only one country in the entire globe that pursues society of liberty and had some degree of success towards it, which is United States of America. This may get some angry response from people living in the so-called free world countries such as Europeans, Canadians, Japanese, or Koreans, or what have you. The people of those countries may ask, are you saying you do not consider us as societies of liberty? As a matter of fact, I do not. And let me explain why. Take those so-called free world allies in Europe, Japan, or even Republic of Korea, for example. While people of those countries may think they pursue liberty, what they actually pursue is limited freedom under collectivism. Let's take freedom of expression, for example. In USA, a simple majority cannot criminalize an expression simply by majority vote. That is liberty. However, in some European countries, a word or an expression that offends the sense of the majority can be criminalized. It is a type of system that even allows criminalizing saying what some group in government power labels as false. Arrests have been made based on these anti-liberty laws. Apparently, the situation is not so different in Canada or other UK Commonwealth. It appears that the situation is similar in Korea, and very unfortunately, I am not only talking about North Korea. So the difference in attitude is that in USA's brand of liberty, freedom is based on what is defined by liberty, while in places like Europe or developed Asian countries, freedom is what is allowed by the collective. Collective will being the justification and source of what freedom individuals should or should not have is not liberty, that is collectivism. However, in case of those free world allies countries, the people of those countries are mostly not even aware that the foundational working principle that controls their countries is collectivism. The reason I bring this matter up is that this difference in attitude applies to each country's attitude towards self-defense. In society more oriented towards liberty, such as USA, self-defense is a right inherent to liberty, so justification of any right associated, such as gun rights, is not a matter of popularity or collective sentiment. A situation where you have no means to resist subjugation or other victimization by thugs when a thug is stronger or thugs are superior in number is, in fact, not a situation of liberty. This is not subject to majority opinion, it is a logical fact. However, in collectivist countries, the right of self-defense is treated in the same fashion as they treat right of freedom of expression. To them, a right of self-defense is what the collective allows or disallows. Level of force allowed or means of force can be given or taken by the collective according to what idea is most popular at the time. And considering the reality that most collectivist countries' policies are decided by a few elite controlling class rather than actually by the collective, it is more often so determined by the expediencies of the controlling elites. Which is the reason why those countries pretend to be countries free of guns, but there is no shortage of guns protecting the elites. The collectivist, like any mob-based ideology, primarily moves by sentiment, sensation. This is the reason why collectivist societies often have equality of force as the standard of what level of force is justified for self-defense, even if their law does not explicitly say so. Either that or some other absurd standard. On a number of occasions, I have encountered people outside of USA expressing aversion to use of guns against thugs with less effective weapons, such as a knife, even if the thugs logically pose a threat of serious injury or death. A simple and most obvious example are those ignorant people who get bewildered and say, "Why did he shoot him with a gun? The thug only had a knife." A lot of them being foreigners who comment on news from USA. When asked for a reason why they think that way, the most common answer was something to the effect of, "It is unfair." So this is a sensation-driven judgment from perception of uneven level of force, irrationally seeing the thug as the victim when inequality of level of force is irrelevant. This ignores the fact that the person with a gun is defending liberty against a thug who is threatening the person. It is an idiocy and absurdity of irrationally perceiving the thug as the victim for no other reason than the thug being less capable of force, when it is the thug who is in the wrong, ignoring that the inequality of force is irrelevant and that it is the thug who is responsible for creating that situation. There were numerous times when I heard thugs who justifiably got shot being mentioned as a victim by irrational people holding this type of sentiment. The sensation is fleeting in a way, but also pervasive in a way to the mob. When people see the aftermath of an innocent victim being forced to fight using equal force, people may sympathize with the innocent victim receiving damage in equal mutual combat. However, usually that is only limited to that moment. That does not extend to fixing the systematic injustice that causes it. After the moment has passed, they are right back to supporting the irrational equal level force, equal fight mentality. It is a typical dumb mob mentality that is governed by moment-to-moment sensation. This is barbaric by any measure of reason. An ironic thing is that people of the collectivist attitude perceives ban of guns and the absurd equal force mentality as civilized while criticizing American culture of use of guns as barbaric. However, what is civilization? It is use of accumulated knowledge, reason, and technology to solve problems. It is about making life better. One side advocates innocent people defending their liberty with machines such as guns to destroy threats with least damage to themselves, while the other advocates innocent being maimed while fighting against thugs on equal terms, for no other reason than that being the sentiment of the many. So which side is really civilized and which side is barbaric? When a society coerces an innocent to fight for self-defense against thugs on equal terms and receive equal damage or even more damage than the thugs, there is nothing just about it. There is nothing civilized about it. A society that tells its members your right of self-defense is limited to only using fists or bats, and if your opponent cannot be stopped with that level of force, you should just be struck while you wait for the police. If you get crippled or killed in the process, that is just the price you pay for living in a civilized society. That is not a society of liberty. Anti-gun people detest pro-gun people, saying some people being killed by guns are an acceptable price to pay for a society of liberty. However, anti-gun people are in effect saying disarmed people being killed or maimed because of their inability to defend themselves is an acceptable price to pay to keep society without guns. Collectivist societies often rely more on sensation of safety rather than actual safety. This motivates them to be in a constant state of denial of reality. When those people criticize that people can get killed by guns in USA, people of USA can say we can defend ourselves by also arming ourselves with guns. While that may not be a pleasant answer to the collectivist societies, it is a plausible answer. People of collectivist societies say they can rely on the police for protection and proud of their police response time measured in minutes. An attitude that who can use force should be limited to representative of the collective. However, when people of USA point out that criminals can easily kill or maim people before police arrives, especially when the thugs are superior in strength or number, they do not have any feasible response plan other than hoping for the criminal's mercy. Their plan is either hope for the criminal's mercy or some version of delusional fantasy of using martial arts against thugs of superior strength or numbers. In those societies, collective sentiment fears guns in society more than it fears the danger in reality coming from an average person having no feasible defense plan against thugs with superior strength or numbers. To pacify people who hold this point of view, the media of collectivist countries exaggerate harms of guns in USA while minimizing the benefits. This effect is also assisted by anti-liberty collectivist faction in USA. For example, Democrat or other collectivist side in USA would manipulate or misrepresent statistics. Number of anti-gun factions presented death numbers involving firearms in a way that misleads readers to think criminal death numbers are larger than it is by deceptively including death numbers by suicides in death numbers cited. That is just one of many deceptive tactics employed by those groups. Another example even involves politically biased government agents who sympathize with anti-liberty factions. According to John Lott, interviewed by John Stossel on September 11, 2024, FBI has omitted significant cases of mass murderers being stopped by people defending themselves with guns from mass shooting incident data. According to Lott, when confronted about this, there was even a person in FBI who responded by saying, "Well, I'm a Democrat." Collectivists hate individual liberty. Not only they hate gun rights for individuals, they hate individual right of self-defense. This is the reason Democrats and other collectivists hate stand your ground laws, which protects people who defended themselves from being prosecuted for reason of not retreating first. Those anti-liberty factions tried to protect criminals by mandating the innocent to retreat while risking harm associated with the retreat, and add the risk of not being able to prove the retreat or not being able to prove that the retreat was not feasible. To a collectivist, individual is something that should be subjugated by the collective. Any rights or other instrument that gives individuals power is a threat to their ideology. So, to a collectivist, a right of an individual to use their own judgment to use a deadly weapon, such as a gun, to protect individual rights is the greatest insult to their collectivist ideology. To collectivists such as Democrats, right of self-defense or gun rights or right to have any weapon is a target for attack, and this is reflected in Democrats' legislative activities. So factions such as Democrats have a motive to present sensationalist presentations of harms of guns. However, reality of the matter is that whether if statistics such as overall crime rate being high or low has very little to do with whether if guns are allowed or not. It does not change how many criminals decide to commit crimes. It changes what option individuals have for their defense. Most countries restrict guns more than USA. However, some of them have worse crime statistics than USA, while some of them have better statistics. Mexico, for example, is far more dangerous in terms of crimes than USA when Mexico has far restrictive gun regulations. Some may make an excuse blaming the higher Mexican crime rate on cartels and guns from USA. However, if more gun regulations make society safer, then Mexico should have been able to abolish cartels and control flow of guns from USA. After all, is that not what gun laws are for? In terms of achieving safer society by gun regulation, that is not reality in Mexico. Apparently, the only group of people who cannot get a gun in Mexico are ordinary people who obey the law. And anyone who is not brain dead would know that Mexico is not safe from gun crimes. The foundational reason why guns are available in USA is not because of safety statistics. It is because of foundational right to have an option to use it. It is not something to be taken away when statistics does not look good. Even in USA, gun restrictions vary from state to state. However, safety in terms of crime statistics often does not correlate to how much guns are restricted. For societies or countries where use of guns for self-defense is effectively banned, they also have an additional motivation for denial of reality, that of national or ethnic pride. In sensation or perception-driven collectivist countries, safety is pursued mainly by prohibition and regulations. This mode of thinking is integrated into the identity of their culture. However, when those people realize that there is another society where people are enjoying freedom that is forbidden to people of those collectivist society and living well, that becomes an embarrassment to their belief system or even an insult to their cultural identity. When we made our society safe by banning guns is a part of a cultural identity to a certain society, existence of a society where people enjoy the liberty of having guns and living well becomes an embarrassment. So their most common response is to believe that people of USA lives in constant terror because of guns. Imagine what believing otherwise would mean to those people. People whose government tells them to just comply to what criminals tell them to do. Those people may feel a sense of validation or consolation from hearing about crimes committed by guns in USA, while ignoring that criminals in their own countries kill or maim just as well with or without weapons. However, to people of USA, gun rights is a part of the reason to live in USA, not a reason to leave.